It is literally like a single degree outside right now. I am unbelievably cold. But we have things to talk about, we have stories to tell and makeup to do, so I'm going to bundle myself in blankets and just deal with it. Or try to. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane and I like to paint crap on my face. This particular video is part of a series where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths and legends. Each week I will be trying to bring one of these stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creature or creatures behind the legends. Last week we looked at sirens, which took us all the way from ancient Greek to TikTok, which was a journey. This week we are covering something a little bit more recent, but I would say surprisingly still is relevant on social media, because today we are going to be talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Mothman. Or the Mothman? I'm not sure on his exact, formal title, but anyway, grab a seat, grab a drink, get yourself settled, and let's dive in. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, all of the products that I use will be listed in the description box down below. I will also apologise in advance for any pronunciation errors or any words or names that I get wrong. I do genuinely try my hardest, but some of the words and names that are involved in these stories are... But as always, feel free to correct me if I do get them wrong. So, Mothman. Now, everyone has probably heard of Mothman, though potentially more through meme lore and sort of internet humor necessarily than folklore. There are various books and films, TV show references, and just other modern iterations and mentions of this creature. Not forgetting the fact that Mothman has also become a very popular, very low effort but highly amusing Halloween costume, usually involving a black sheet, some wings, and some big red circles. Despite how well known this creature is nowadays, in the grand scheme of myth and legend, it's a very modern tale. I'd probably almost class it as an urban legend than folklore, because it was first reported in a place in West Virginia called Point Pleasant in 1966. But before we look into Mothman in particular, West Virginia actually has a very interesting history when it comes to folktale and legend and mythology, specifically in relation to what are known as cryptids. Now, I had heard of cryptids, but I will be fully honest with you, didn't actually know what they were. So, a cryptid is explained as an animal that cryptozoologists believe may exist somewhere in the world, but for the most part, their existence has been either disputed or kind of disproved or disregarded by actual science. As a result, cryptozoology itself is considered a bit of a pseudoscience. It was founded in the 1950s, and it focused primarily on sort of stories and tales that have usually been rejected by the scientific community. So where biologists will regularly identify new species using very established scientific techniques and methodology, cryptozoologists focus almost entirely on the things like folklore and rumour. And as sort of pseudosciences go, it is often compared to things like ghost hunting and something called ufology? 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 The UFO stuff. Now, some of the most well-known examples of a cryptid is things like Bigfoot or the Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster, the Jersey Devil, and of course, Mothman. This is another one of those cases where I fell down so many rabbit holes just all the way through. And I mean, there is a huge list of cryptids from all over the world, because I don't know why I always associate cryptids with certain parts of America, like the Appalachian Trails or the national parks, that kind of thing. I don't know why I so heavily associate them with that area, but there's an insane amount of cryptids just throughout the world. If you know of any interesting ones, let me know, and if there's any that you want me to cover, again, let me know, because cryptids are fascinating. Now, each cryptid is generally associated with a specific area, and in some cases, these little towns, these areas, they become known as cryptid towns. Now, a cryptid town will have a very close history and sort of cultural identity related to a local cryptid, including things like festivals, museums, visitor centres, research centres, statues, just a whole host of crap, basically dedicated to this particular local creature that it's associated with. And generally speaking, the aim and the goal of all these things they do is usually to drive cryptid-related tourism. Point Pleasant is considered a cryptid town. But interestingly enough, West Virginia actually has another cryptid town called Sutton, which is linked to the cryptid known as the Flatwoods Monster, despite the fact that the Flatwoods Monster originated in Flatwoods, not Sutton. One of the other probably most well-known cryptid towns is Drumnadrochit in Scotland, which is the home of the Loch Ness Monster. Now, they have the Loch Ness Centre and something called Nessieland, which is basically this sort of centre dedicated to the history, the story, the legend behind the creature. It's kind of like an immersive experience, and there's a huge gift shop at the end of it. I went there on a family holiday years ago, and it is genuinely really quite fun. They've made it very, like, family-friendly entertainment kind of vibes. You walk into the gift shop and it's just a wall full of stuffed toy Nessie dolls. Now, whilst the Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster are the most well-known cryptids in West Virginia, there's actually a huge list of other cryptids associated with that state. So, you have one that is known as the Grafton Monster, which is a large, headless creature with smooth, sort of almost seal-like skin, which... Ugh. I don't know, like, the description of the skin like that kind of makes me think of Sexy Flanders. Do you get what I mean? Like, just weird... I don't know. Well, there's another creature known as the Ogwa, which is a 20-foot serpentine turtle-type creature with a really long body that resembles a dragon, but that it also has, like, really large, powerful flippers. Which, now that I think about it, actually sounds quite similar to how the Loch Ness Monster is often described, so maybe they're related or something. You then have the Sheep Squatch, which, shockingly enough, is a large woolly sheep kind of creature with really sharp horns, fangs, clawed hands that stands on two legs. You also have what is possibly my favourite name for a creature that I've come across so far, is the Snallygaster, which is a dragon-like creature with massive wings, a sharp beak, and tentacles. Kind of makes it sound a bit like a flying kraken. Or coming in a very close second to that one is the Snarly Yow, which is this big, wolfy kind of creature with big glowing eyes and a really long, sort of shaggy mane. I look like a big, creepy egg right now. Now, because the Mothman legend is so recent, a lot of the information and the lore and sort of reports and stories surrounding it are all fairly well documented. So the first sighting occurred on November 15th in 1966, when two couples from Point Pleasant reported to police that they had seen a large black creature whose eyes, like, glowed red, standing at the side of the road near what was known as the TNT area, which was basically the sort of nickname given to the site of a former World War II munitions plant. They'd been out for the evening, just out having a lovely little drive, and initially they thought they saw, like, car headlights or, like, car lights, these two glowing lights. But then they realised that the lights were moving, and the way that they were moving as it got closer, they realised it was a pair of eyes. And then as it got closer, this sort of figure began to take shape, and it just scared the bejesus out of them. Now, the creature was described as a slender, muscular man, about 7 foot tall, with white wings and glowing red eyes. However, the witnesses weren't able to provide really any more details about what the creature looked like, because apparently they had been so kind of, like, hypnotized by the eyes. Now, after seeing this enormous creature just emerging from out of nowhere in the darkness, the couples were, understandably, terrified. And they fled the scene from where they were, reporting that the creature then, like, flew after them, making this really awful, like, screeching sound. And basically the creature pursued them all the way to the, like, city limits of Point Pleasant. Now, while in most scenarios you would imagine that people arriving at a police station saying that they've seen this, like, big, scary figure with glowing red eyes, like, flying after them, you'd imagine the officers would be a bit like, eh. But Point Pleasant was a very small, fairly close-knit town, kind of everybody knew everybody, and the officers on duty that night knew these two couples. They knew who were involved, and they were very honest people. They weren't the kind to make things up or anything like that. So the story was believed. As such, the first ever newspaper report of this creature was published the next day on November 16th in the Point Pleasant Register, titled "Couple See Man-Sized Bird Creature Something." Now, being this very sort of close-knit, quiet town, a story like this did spread very quickly. And in the days following the report in the newspaper, more and more people started reporting very similar sightings in the area, including 2 volunteer firemen who described it as just a large bird with red eyes. There was another witness who claimed that when he aimed a flashlight at the creature in a nearby field, its eyes glowed back like bicycle reflectors, and a lot of people then began blaming sort of weird things happening on the sightings of this creature, such as like radio interference, buzzing noises coming from TV sets. And there was one guy who eventually ended up blaming the disappearance of his dog on this creature, but not everyone believed these stories. There was a wildlife biologist at the West Virginia University who spoke to reporters and stated that the description that had been given throughout all of these sightings actually matched that of a bird known as the sandhill crane, which is this enormous bird, almost as tall as a man, with about a 7-foot wingspan and like reddish colouring around its eyes. He believed that the bird may have sort of wandered away from its like migration route, which is why no one in the area recognised it as being a bird, because it wasn't native, so they'd never seen one before. Now, despite all of the descriptions that stated it was like a bird man creature and all of the possible explanations of the sightings being related to birds, the newspapers started to coin the term Mothman, which evidently stuck. However, a lot of people believed that the name Mothman may have actually been influenced by Batman, of all things. At the time that these stories first started coming out, the Batman TV show was really, really popular. So Batman and his array of villains were very much in the public eye. And there is one villain in particular that people will often look to as the sort of origin for the term Mothman, which was a villain known as Killer Moth. Now, whilst this particular villain did not appear in the TV show, it did appear in the comics, which, alongside the TV show, were still hugely popular at the time. So I guess they kind of just took, like, Batman, but then needed another creature, so just went with Moth. So, Mothman. I would say it's not the most inventive name, but, I mean, it did its job. People are still talking about it. Now, other than the initial 1996 sightings, there are 2 other sort of main incidents that involved this particular cryptid. One of which, and arguably the most well-known, was on December 15th, a year later in 1967, when an I-bar chain suspension bridge known as the Silver Bridge collapsed. This bridge carried Route 35 over the Ohio River, connecting Point Pleasant with a place called Gallipolis in Ohio, and it was during very heavy rush hour traffic that the bridge collapsed, resulting in the deaths of 46 people, 2 of which who unfortunately were never found. Now, investigations into the disaster and the wreckage eventually identified the failure of a single I-bar in one of the suspension chains as the reason for the collapse. I didn't understand too much about what they found because it was all very sort of technical, engineering based, but from what I could gather, the failure was triggered by a flaw that was like 0.1 inches deep, or like 2.5 millimeters deep, which then led to a fracture, which then obviously caused the collapse. And it took over 3 years to fully investigate this following the initial report. And this collapse then led to very significant changes in the way that bridges were like inspected and maintained throughout the US. It was found it wasn't like anyone's fault, it wasn't the designer's fault or the engineer's fault, it was just the fault was so kind of particular that the current investigation standards at the time would have never been able to identify it, which is why the way they investigated bridges after this then had to change. However, this particular disaster did end up being linked to the Mothman and has actually become a very big part of the creature's legacy. Now, there's an author by the name of John Keel who in 1975 released a book called The Mothman Prophecies. Now, this particular book further cemented this link between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse, almost to the point where the legend of Mothman has kind of in some ways overshadowed the actual event and sort of cause of the collapse. There was a phrase that I saw used to refer to this. I can't remember if it was like narrative bias or something, where basically when people hear about the Silver Bridge collapse, they think of the Mothman story rather than what actually happened. Now, despite alleged claims that he was seen on or near the bridge shortly before it collapsed, Mothman wasn't blamed for causing the collapse. Instead, his sighting was considered like a warning of the impending disaster, and following the bridge collapse, the creature was allegedly seen before a number of different disasters, including things like tsunamis and earthquakes and even the 9/11 terror attacks. The belief being that he appeared in these instances as a warning before these events happened. Through that, he basically just became this bad omen of disaster and tragedy. The other main sort of noted story about Mothman and his link to impending disaster was all the way over in Russia in 1999, when a newspaper in Georgia printed a story about Russian UFOlogists, these people who study UFOs, claiming to have seen Mothman in Moscow shortly before the 1999 Russian apartment bombings. I think this is going how I want it to, but we'll see. Due to the rising awareness and subsequent popularity of the Mothman, Point Pleasant has become synonymous with the creature and have fully embraced it, to be honest. They even have an annual Mothman festival that started in 2002. Over 20 years that festival has been going. It's mind-boggling. But basically the festival was the result of a lot of brainstorming ideas for the town trying to find ways to attract visitors and tourists, and they chose Mothman as the focal point because of the uniqueness of the story and as a way of kind of celebrating this local legacy within the town. And obviously it's been going on for over 20 years, and according to the organisers, the festival attracts between 10 to 12,000 people every year. They put on a huge range of events and activities on during the festival, such as guest speakers. They have vendor exhibits in different stalls. They have pancake eating contests, and they do hay rides of all the local sort of notable areas. After the first festival, the town unveiled a 12-foot tall metal statue of Mothman that they commissioned from artist and sculptor Bob Roach. And following the unveiling of the statue, they created a Mothman museum and a research centre that then opened in 2005. Now, obviously, the popularity of this legend has absolutely done wonders for this town, and a lot of the families and the locals in the area do genuinely believe that the Mothman is a real creature. Like I said at the beginning, beside the 1975 novel and the subsequent film, which I will come back to, the Mothman character has been featured in a very large number of TV shows and films and video games, from X-Files to Watchmen to Fallout 76. There is merchandise of this creature. You can get cuddly toys of it. I think Build-A-Bear released a limited edition Mothman plushie, which I'm not gonna lie, I kind of want, but the popularity of the creature has, like a lot of local legends, very much split people's beliefs. Obviously, some people believing that the creature is very much real, a lot of the locals believing that he exists or did exist in one form or another, going even further as to some actually believing that he's a kind of alien or supernatural manifestation, while others lean more into the kind of conspiracy theory side of things and believe that Mothman is related to the whole sort of Men in Black idea. Obviously, the Men in Black conspiracy being that there are secret sort of government agents who keep a very tight lid on anything supernatural or need-to-know basis, with the whole memory wipe thing. Just picture the film and there are people who genuinely believe that that is a thing. This was not particularly helped by the fact that there were a huge number of hoaxes that came out following the initial reported sightings. One example I found was a group of construction workers who tied flashlights to helium balloons at night and then just let them off. But other than all the hoaxes, there are a number of sort of scientific theories and reasons that have been put forward to try and explain everything that's happened. Now, this obviously includes like the sandhill crane theory, as well as a number of other birds, such as like a barred owl. And the whole like glowing red eye thing was basically the result of the red eye effect, which is like flash photos or other bright lights reflecting off the back of the eye. Think of any like old photographs you see where people basically the entire iris of their eye just shines red. It was just that. People at night with flashlights and car headlights just reflecting off whatever animal's eyes. And if you think about it as well, like birds and like owls especially, they have really big eyes. So if you just see this like big shadowy creature and you get the red eye effect, they're gonna look massive. The correlation between the Mothman and these other like pseudosciences like cryptozoology and UFOs have even further divided people's kind of opinion on the creature and the story as a whole, because it's led to a lot of people viewing Mothman and his legend as being more in the realm of like conspiracy theories than it is like mythology and folklore. Interestingly enough, there was one folklorist who identified a lot of elements within like the Mothman sightings that were in common with a lot of much older folk tales, and he suggested that something real may have triggered the initial fear and sightings, such as a big bird, and that basically through retelling and kind of glamorization a little bit, the story became kind of connected and sort of mashed together with these pre-existing folklore. One really interesting theory that I found was that Mothman was actually the result of a 200-year-old curse following the death of a Shawnee leader known as Cornstalk. So back in the mid-18th century, like 1760, 1770 kind of time, Cornstalk was a Shawnee leader in the Ohio County, the Shawnee being a Native American people of sort of the northeastern woodlands, and he played a major part during the defence of the Shawnee homeland during the expansion of the British American colonies. He was like the primary Shawnee war chief during Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, and he led the Shawnees and other native warriors against the colonies at the Battle of Point Pleasant. Now, the Shawnee people were vastly outnumbered during this battle, and despite putting up a very valiant effort, when even more colonist reinforcements arrived, Cornstalk ordered for the retreat of his men. Now, following this, Cornstalk became like an advocate for the Shawnee people to remain neutral during the American Revolutionary War, believing that trying to fight the Americans would be disastrous for their people, and he successfully negotiated an end to Lord Dunmore's war. And apparently one of Lord Dunmore's officers even noted that he had never heard anyone deliver a speech so powerfully as Cornstalk did on that day. Whilst there were many Shawnees who did continue to fight the Americans to try and reclaim their land, Cornstalk acted as a very strong voice of moderation, and when the revolution followed shortly afterwards, Cornstalk tried to keep his people neutral and maintain peaceful relations with the Americans. Despite his best efforts, there were pockets of resistance to this, and by the winter of 1776, the Shawnees were basically divided between Cornstalk's neutral faction and the militant bands that continued to fight for their lands. Now, almost a year later, in October of 1777, two Shawnees visited Fort Randolph, which was an American fort built at the site of the Battle of Point Pleasant. But the two Shawnees were detained by the fort's commander, who had basically just decided to hold hostage any Shawnees who fell into his hands. Cornstalk's son then arrived a few days later to basically try and find out why his men were being detained, with Cornstalk arriving even sooner after that, but eventually all four of them were then detained. On November 10th, an American man who was stationed at the fort was killed by unknown natives in the area, and in retaliation, the soldiers at the fort brutally executed Cornstalk, his son, and the 2 other Shawnees. The aftermath of Cornstalk's death was huge, with many people believing that it caused the Shawnees to go to war against the Americans. But, as others have pointed out, there were many militant Shawnees who had already decided to do that. But Cornstalk's death did mean that the Shawnees lost a very important and influential voice of moderation, and this did lead to many of them then believing that the Americans could not be trusted. The first governor of Virginia under the US was outraged by these killings and ordered that Cornstalk's vile assassins be brought to justice. And whilst the alleged killers were named and eventually brought to trial, their fellow soldiers refused to testify against them, meaning that all of them were acquitted. Cornstalk was originally buried at Fort Randolph. However, in 1840, his grave was rediscovered, and his remains were then moved to the Mason County Courthouse grounds. His gravesite remained there for over 100 years until in 1954, when the courthouse was eventually torn down, his remains were once again moved to the site of the Battle of Point Pleasant. This area is now known as the Tuendaway State Park, and there is actually a grave marker and sort of plaque dedicated to Cornstalk there. After his remains were moved to this state park, local sort of murmurings and rumours started of Cornstalk's dying curse, which became associated with many sort of misfortunes in the area. Regional stories claim that Cornstalk finally took his revenge in the 1960s by sending the Mothman to terrorise the people of Point Pleasant, culminating in the collapse of the Silver Bridge, after which the Mothman sightings in the area seemed to stop. Whilst Mothman started out as like a local legend that then gained sort of international fame and notoriety, the theory regarding the Curse of Cornstalk is, I think, still a very much localised legend because I'd never heard of it before. Now, the other side of a lot of theories relating to Mothman goes back to the novel that was published in 1975 by John Keel. Now, this novel covered his investigations into the alleged sightings of the Mothman, and he combined it with his theories about UFOs and various other like supernatural phenomena, including something called ultra-terrestrials, who are able to use some sort of like psychic power to create hallucinations, such as the Mothman or UFOs. I think I just flicked some of that into my eye. Interestingly enough, in 2002, when the film adaptation of Keel's novel was released, there was a journalist who published an analysis of loads of private letters between Keel and another known UFO researcher during Keel's research into Mothman. And this particular journalist reported finding really significant differences between what Keel wrote at the time of his investigation versus what was then actually written in the first book about Mothman, which again just raised further questions as to the accuracy of this book. Keel was also apparently known for writing humorous and sort of outlandish letters to his friends and associates, and he apparently refused to help this journal in clarifying the differences between his original research and what was then published. Whilst a lot of people did question the accuracy of his book, there is no denying the impact that his book had, because in 2002, the book was adapted into a film of the same name, starring Richard Gere and Laura Linney. The film, in turn, has become a bit of a cult classic. Now, a bit sneakily, the film was marketed as being based on true events, and it falls into the realm of supernatural, horror, mystery kind of genres. The general gist is about a man named John who's a reporter who starts investigating and researching into the legend of Mothman after the kind of weird death of his wife, where shortly before she died, she claimed to have seen the creature and produced these really creepy looking drawings of it. After a series of very weird and hard to explain things, John finds himself in Point Pleasant, where there have been numerous sightings of an unnamed creature and a load of unexplained phenomena happening, and he worked really closely with the local sheriff to try and get to the bottom of it. And there are several instances of people either sort of dreaming about or hearing voices or just kind of generally hallucinating something that gives them these really strange cryptic messages, be it like a word and a number or some kind of flashing image. Spoiler alert, these later turn out to be almost like premonitions of future disasters, kind of similar to like the visions that they get in like the Final Destination films, or that other film with Nick Cage that started out really, really good, where they pull out like a time capsule and one of the things in there is like a bit of paper that has the like date and time and location of major disaster that had happened in like the last 50 years. And like, it was a really, really good, I can't remember what it's called. It was a really, really good film, and then it went really weird. If you remember what it is, please tell me, because I cannot remember. Anyway, the film culminates in all of the main characters ending up on the Silver Bridge, where a malfunctioning set of traffic lights leads to insanely heavy congestion, where the bridge then begins to collapse, where basically the whole thing relates back to like different premonitions that each character had. The end of the film states that the cause of the bridge collapse was never fully determined, and that even though Mothman was seen in like other parts of the world, he was never really seen in Point Pleasant again after that. Interestingly enough, there is another very legendary creature that is referred to in Keel's book that then actually makes an appearance in the film as well, known as Indrid Cold, or the Grinning Man, or in some cases, the Smiling Man. Now, Indrid Cold is very commonly associated with UFOs, and he's believed to be some form of like alien or being of extraterrestrial origin. And again, he's very often associated with the whole like Men in Black thing. In the first sighting, he was described as being a tall, sort of humanoid entity wearing a reflective green suit with a black belt with an inhumanly large smile. And some witnesses claim that the creature had like no ears and no nose, no hair, and his skin had like a greenish kind of tint to it with like really dark beady eyes that were set slightly too far apart. I saw like a few sort of artist depictions of it, and it's very unnerving. The second sighting, however, described him very differently, in that he was wearing a blue suit, not a green one, but still like a weird metallic-y reflective kind of suit. But otherwise, he was a perfectly normal-looking man with like a tan and slicked back hair, slightly creepy grin, but otherwise all features still there. The first sighting occurred on October 16th in 1966, and it was actually in New Jersey. It was two young boys who claimed that they saw the figure through a fence, who eventually ended up like chasing them. And apparently there were also a number of reported UFO sightings in that area at that time. The second sighting occurred less than a month later on November 2nd, 1966, this time in Parkersburg, West Virginia, around the same time as the Mothman sighting started. According to the reports by a man named Woodrow Derenberger, who had the second encounter with Indrid Cold, he was driving home when an unidentifiable vehicle landed in front of him. The grinning man came out, walked up to him, and telepathically said that his name was Indrid Cold. He meant him no harm, he simply wanted to learn more about the human race. And he apparently revealed that he came from a planet named Lanulos in the Ganymedes galaxy, and there were two other grinning men by the names of Demo Hassan and Carl Ardo. I'm pretty sure I have just butchered every single word in that sentence, so I do apologise. Now, over in Point Pleasant, there was apparently a third encounter by the Lilly family, who had been reporting like poltergeist activity within their home. And then one night, their daughter was sleeping and woke up to see a man standing over her, described as a big man, very broad. And when he moved round the bed towards her, she hid under the covers, and then when she removed them, she found that he was gone. The daughter stated that while she couldn't see any details on the man's face, she could see that he was grinning at her. But this has been quite a big topic for debate, because between the three different encounters, it kind of just sounds like 3 different creatures, because whilst generally speaking it's accepted that Indrid Cold is some kind of like alien entity due to the connection with like UFO sightings and the report from Derenberger, the third encounter suggests that it's maybe like a ghost or a spirit connected to like unusual poltergeist activity. And this third sighting especially has been distanced quite a lot from the first 2, and some believe it was like maybe a prank that just went a bit too far. Others believe that it may have just been a man with some form of mental illness who had broken in, or even just a bit of a hoax based off the popularity of the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant at the time. Unfortunately for Derenberger, his encounter with Indrid Cold had a profoundly negative impact on his life, because the media caught wind of this encounter and the story just completely blew up. And while he and his family maintained that they had multiple sightings of Cold, it led to a lot of locals and strangers and tourists visiting his house trying to catch a glimpse of this creature. The family received years of really harassing phone calls, and they began to blame things like job loss and friends who had distanced themselves on Derenberger's tales of this being. And it did actually eventually lead to his wife divorcing him over his obsession with this creature. Derenberger as well ended up suffering from really painful headaches and eventually even depression until he moved away from the area to try and escape the notoriety of his name and his home. But before he moved, it was during Keel's investigations into the Mothman that Derenberger spoke to Keel, and the legend of Indrid Cold was then linked to the Mothman. And again, it leads to quite a lot of skepticism surrounding the Mothman legend in general, leaning more into the pseudoscience side of things rather than mythology. Now, whilst Indrid Cold's connection to the Mothman is based purely on Keel's association between the two, there is another creature here in England that is, in some cases, considered to be like the English counterpart to the Mothman, known as Owlman. Which, I can't with the names on this one. Now, Owlman, as you can guess, is a large, owl-like humanoid creature said to live in Cornwall, and has been sighted several times, the first of which was in 1976 in the village of Mornan. The first sighting was put forward by a man called Tony Doc Shields, who was a paranormal researcher who claimed that he had investigated a report from 2 young girls who were on holiday in the area, who claimed they saw a large winged creature flying above the church tower on April 17th, 1976. Now, according to most versions of this story, the girls were so frightened by the size of this large feathered bird man that their father actually cut the holiday short when he heard what happened. And according to Shields, one of the girls provided him with like a drawing of the creature, which he then dubbed Owlman. The story was published in a pamphlet to do with another local legend of the area, and it made its way through Cornwall in 1976. According to Shields, on the 3rd of July, 2 14-year-old girls who were camping in the woods near the church heard like a hissing sound, and they turned round to see a figure that looked like an owl as big as a man with pointed ears and red eyes. And the girls then reported that the creature flew up into the air, revealing like black, almost pincer-like claws. I suppose talons would be more accurate, I guess. Following this, there were like sporadic sightings of Owlman in the area surrounding the church in 1978 and 79, then again in 1989 and 1995, and according to legend, a loud owl-like sound could be heard at night in like the courtyard of the church during the year 2000, which, I mean, that it could just be an owl? Now, Shields and his like paranormal investigations were actually part of a series of like monster-raising exploits that he did in 1976, but before all this, he was an English-born artist, writer, and magician. Now, he became very well known for this series of monster raising exploits, and particularly after he began trying to invoke the monsters, apparently with the aid of a coven of nude witches. But these exploits that he went on included his attempts to raise Morgul, the Cornish sea monster, the reports of Owlman, as well as photos that he claimed were taken of the Loch Ness Monster, which actually then appeared on the front page of a national newspaper. But because Shields was known as a bit of an eccentric with a fondness for hoaxes, a lot of people believe that he invented the Owlman legend, especially given that he was directly involved in the reportings of the first 2 sightings. Although there are reported sightings from people who had nothing to do with him, including one which described the creature as being about 5 foot tall, the legs had high ankles, and the feet were large and black with 2 huge toes on the visible side, and the creature was grey with brown markings and eyes that very distinctly glowed. Which, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, that just sounds like a big owl, and they are known for nesting in church towers. Have you ever seen those big owls when they lift up the body and they've got the weird little, the legs are surprisingly long, and it kind of looks like they've just got big ankles. It's a bird. That's an owl. Now, among these owls that tend to nest in church towers, one of them is barn owls, or the Eurasian eagle owl, which is literally one of the largest species of owl. Their wingspan can be over 6 foot as well. They're enormous. But I mean, possible hoaxes about Owlman especially aside, I did see a lot of very amusing content during my research into people having quite hefty debates over who would win in a fight between Owlman and Mothman. I honestly don't know who I'd pick, because as far as I'm aware, neither of them necessarily have any special ability. They never did anything to anyone. They just they potentially chased a few people, or just happened to be in an area before something bad. What do they do? I don't know how that fight would play out. Who do you think would win between Owlman and Mothman? Let me know in the comments. Okay, I know this look is a little bit all over the place at the moment. I'm hoping when I add the final pieces it will all kind of come together. So let me go and do the little final touches to hopefully try and redeem myself with this right now. There is something I want to try. It may or may not work, so you may or may not see the results of it, but I'll be back in just a moment and we can finish up. Is it working? Is the illusion working? I'm not gonna lie, I feel ridiculous, but kind of cute. Full disclosure, this look did not go how I'd intended it to. The super cool technique that I wanted to use just didn't even remotely work, so oh well, that's life, I guess. The one upside to this though is that it has given me an excuse to put my coat back on, so I am now so toasty. Also, do you like my terribly applied kind of antenna hair feathers? Why is every iteration of Mothman I see just so low budget? Obviously, the general idea with this is that I would have my eyes closed for the whole time to kind of give the glowing eyes illusion thing. I know this look is a bit simpler compared to some of the other ones that I've done, but I wanted to try and give myself a bit of a challenge with highlighting and contour, and I have a little bit of a play around with stuff that I don't normally do, so I don't know how I feel about it. But here we are. Let me know what you guys think of the look, of the story of Mothman in general. I didn't really know anything about Mothman other than the running jokes and meme lore that exists online because of it. I had no real idea about the backstory or where it came from. So it was really interesting to look into. I can't lie, I was mildly disappointed when it started going into alien and sort of UFO conspiracy theory territory. Because don't get me wrong, I love me a good conspiracy theory, but I don't know, I'm kind of bored of aliens. I think I definitely prefer reading up about and listening to stories of the old ancient myths and legends rather than sort of urban legends or more newer stories like that. But let me know what you guys think, because I'm really curious. Obviously, Mothman is an incredibly popular character, so let me know who or what else you would like me to cover. Leave your requests or suggestions in the comments down below. Obviously, next week we are into December, so I think I'm going to do some sort of December holiday Christmassy themed episodes again, because I found some really fascinating ones similar to what I did in October. So every week in December will be some Christmas related demon story, I don't know. But if you have any particular requests along those lines, let me know in the comments down below as well. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day. Thank you for hanging out with me. I appreciate you all very much. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye.